if you are selling out, then what is the smart thing for you to do as a business owner? Hi there, Kelsey Toner here, the founder of Guest Focused Tour Business Coaching, where every day myself and our team of talented, experienced, and lovely tour business coaches are helping you build a thriving, profitable tour business. Welcome back to our series on how to price tours, activities, and experiences for profit. We've covered a lot of the fundamentals of effective tour pricing, as well as shared some tools, templates, best practices, and a lot of practical examples for setting you up for success. In this video, we're going to be talking specifically to multi-day operators and really going through some of the special considerations when pricing a multi-day tour, activity, or experience. Pricing for larger and longer group trips is simply different. We're dealing with, in many cases, higher stakes, longer booking windows, and more variables that can impact your profitability. Well, we don't need a whole lot of complexity, but we do need some simple best practices and some things to avoid. So in this series, we're going to go through 4 critical areas that should help you avoid some of those common mistakes that we see operators making every day and guide you towards those foundations that will allow you to have a profitable multi-day tour activity business for years to come. Firstly, let's talk about group size economics and cost buffers. So most obviously, your group size directly impacts your profitability, but it varies by tour type. And the general rule of thumb is larger tours, more people on the tour, they are more profitable. Fewer people on the tour, you've got to charge significantly more. But bottom line, you've got to know your numbers using a cost plus calculator. The European city, more budget focused, multi-day tour through Mexico will have a significantly different cost profile than maybe an African safari. So especially important is calculating your break-even group size using that cost plus calculator. Set your minimum break-even plus add 1 or 2 people at minimum to aim for your target profit margin. Always have a plan for what happens if you don't reach your minimum. So as a quick reminder, if you aren't familiar with that cost plus pricing or value-based pricing or the concept of break-even points or trip minimums, I highly encourage you to go back and watch this entire series. We're not going to revisit all of that, but there are some important additional cost buffers that we want you to be thinking about as a multi-day operator. The first is important for anyone doing any kind of international departure, and that is currency risk. Currency risk can destroy your margins if you're not prepared. Just as a real world example, let's say you price a $4,000 European tour in January, but for a September departure, a full 9 months later. And let's say your accommodation costs are 2,000 euros per person. And if the euro strengthens 10% against the US dollar, as an example, by September, then your costs can increase to 2,200 per person, eliminating over $200 in profit. So let's go through some simple strategies that actually work for smaller and medium-sized operators in this area. Well, one, it depends on what your currency exposure is. So let's say if you've got a 60% of your costs are in a foreign currency, then you might want to have somewhere between a 5 to 8% buffer. That's actually a line item in your cost plus calculator. That's a buffer, meaning that if that currency fluctuates in a way that's not favorable to you as the business owner, that's not going to come out of your profits. That's why that buffer is there. And if it goes the other way, then hey, great news for you. That's not only some additional profit that might come your way, but you've also got that buffer, which is essentially go as profit. What about unstable currencies or uncertain markets where we see increased volatility? Then we might want to increase that buffer, or almost certainly we would want to increase that buffer. Maybe 8% or even 10% might be appropriate depending on the circumstances and the amount of volatility. We might also want higher buffers if we have a longer window of time. If we're really booking out over the course of 12 months and there's a higher risk associated with more time or more volatility, then that might change the equation if we are selling a trip that's only 3 or 4 months out. A second best practice is to really lock in your supplier rates whenever possible and read the fine print on those contracts. Do you have written confirmation that rates won't change due to currency fluctuations, or negotiate fixed rates to make sure that you know exactly what you're going to be paying? You can also consider paying deposits in that local currency to lock in exchange rates for major expenses, especially if you've got that cash on hand and you want to lock in a favorable exchange rate. If you do lead trips pretty consistently to areas that have a lot of this volatility, and maybe you're a little bit nervous about having a large buffer go, rate on and passed on to the customer, maybe they're price sensitive or that could impact your sales, you could also have a kind of rider or a clause between you and your guests. I would certainly make sure that this is clearly communicated. It's upfront that, hey, that we see currency fluctuations over 10%, there may need to be a supplementary fee or something like that. But this isn't super common, to be honest. Typically what we're doing is we're talking about when we can absorb some of those currency fluctuations. So build in a buffer that's going to protect you, and then ideally just have trip minimums that are high enough that you don't have to worry about that currency fluctuation coming out of your bottom line. The real takeaway from this section is to have those preventative measures in place. If you're not using a buffer, use one. As a quick aside, one of our coaching members had planned out and booked a trip and they didn't have that buffer in there. And we were talking about how we could make this trip profitable again. And instead of going back and asking for more money from the group members who were coming, we came up with some creative solutions to have some additional upsells, some additional offers. She started adding a few packages before and after with a little bit more of a markup to help offset some of what she lost in that currency fluctuation. So we can be creative in not necessarily having to go back to clients and ask for more money, but instead coming up with some creative ways to have value add and maybe have an upsell or an extra package to help recover some of those losses. Okay, on to another important topic for multi-day operators, and that's thinking about double occupancy rooms and single occupancy. The industry norm is that if a single or solo would like to come on the trip and ultimately book out a double room, that's going to, in many cases, prevent you from having an additional person on the tour. And so we often are having a single supplement to help make up for those losses. So let's talk about it. So here's the simple economics. If you, as the operator, are paying for double occupancy rooms regardless, then single travelers should contribute meaningfully to help cover that cost. So what does a smart single supplement strategy look like? Well, it often depends on the demand for your departures. So for high demand departures, meaning there's lots of people who want to come and you could quite easily get someone in that double room, well, then we could charge as much as 50 to 75% as a supplemental charge simply because we can, because this is going to be a bigger opportunity cost to sell to that single or solo. Now for lower demand departures or trips when we're not selling out rapidly, that single supplement might need to be lower. We could be charging between 25 and 50% of the total trip price as that single supplement to encourage more bookings. And it's always a best practice to offer room sharing options for those solo travelers who want to avoid the supplement and may want some help being matched up with another traveler. The key insight here that many multi-day operators are missing is that the single supplement is not just based on cost, it's also based on demand. We're back to that supply and demand. So if you are selling out, then what is the smart thing for you to do as a business owner is increase the cost of accommodating someone who is traveling single or solo because you are going to be missing out on revenue. So the higher the demand, then the higher that single supplement can and should be. The lower the demand, or if we want to encourage bookings, then we can lower that supplemental fee. All right, onward and upward. When we're thinking about pricing our multi-day tours, something that's a really important consideration is the payment timing and cutoff dates. Let's talk about it. Keep in mind that your payment structure affects both cash flow and booking conversion. Firstly, we highly recommend using deposits. Often these deposits are anywhere between 10 and 20% of the total trip price, which is enough to secure a commitment, but not so high that it ultimately prevents bookings or is a single lump sum payment, which might be difficult for some folks. You then need to have really crystal clear payment terms and a final payment date. This can be anywhere between 60 and 90 days before departure, and it allows for planning time, but also we have a window to capture more of those last minute bookings if they're needed. A great best practice here for coming up with what can sometimes feel like complex pricing terms is to have a look not only at your competitors, but companies that you might look up to or established multi-day operators to get a sense of how this information is presented and the exact pricing terms. It also helps, by the way, to work directly with a multi-day tour business coach. We're happy to connect you with one. You can also leverage AI tools to take a complex policy that, I gotta say, sometimes these larger multi-day operators don't have the most friendly client wording. Above all, my takeaway for you to be, I want those payment terms to be easy to understand for the client. Not only because it's gonna help you ultimately enforce them, it's gonna help them avoid some of the hesitations and concerns or anxieties that they might have not knowing exactly what they're signing up to or committing to. So sometimes running those payment terms through a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini can really help distill that down into something that's crystal clear. And of course, working with a lawyer to make sure that if you have terms and agreements, that those will hold up in a court of law or whatever your jurisdiction is. Here's a couple other strategies for multi-day operators. When you're thinking about your cutoff date, if you do still have availability, you don't necessarily have to close bookings at that final payment deadline. We encourage you to accept last-minute bookings, maybe up to 2 weeks before, but require a full payment immediately. You might consider charging a last-minute premium, where we have an extra 10% to the published price for bookings within 30 days, because you're providing the convenience and last-minute travelers often have less price sensitivity. And a third best practice is payment plan flexibility. For tours over $4,000 or $5,000, consider offering payment plans and different payment plan options. Booking software platforms dedicated to multi-day tours make this very easy to either have a 2-pay or a 3-pay or maybe even a low monthly payment. Here's another best practice that's often overlooked. Sometimes people have a deposit to secure your booking, but on your tour sales pages, you often either have that hidden, or sometimes when we're coaching operators, we see that it's not there at all. So we see this big price tag of, okay, maybe it's $5,500 to come on this trip. And it's not until stage 6 or 7 in the checkout process where we see, oh, we only need to put down $500 today. I would strongly encourage you to put that deposit amount right where your full price amount is, to make sure that people understand that, hey, it's only this amount today to get started. A second best practice, as mentioned, is not only to give lots of different options for these payment plans, but one of our operators called out the fact that, hey, these are interest-free payments. Because most of us, when we are collecting payments for a purchase like this, we're not charging interest on the money that they haven't paid to us. So why not frame this as just another perk? If you don't have all that money right now, or that's important for you to keep the money, don't worry, we have interest-free payments to help you out. Final best practice is you can incentivize people who are willing to pay the full amount. Should we consider offering them a couple $100 off the trip, or a 5% or 10% discount if they pay the full amount right here and right now? 100%. Getting that money in means a lot less administrative headache. That person is much more likely to be committed. You can then leverage that extra money to generate more demand, generate more leads. So don't just think about, hey, early booking is better, yes, but minimizing the barrier to make a booking, yes, and encouraging or incentivizing to give you more money up front. Let's talk a little bit more about those minimum group size policies and how it relates to pricing. So not only is it important to understand your minimum group size and your cutoff dates internally, right? For profitability, for your revenue, sometimes these are set by your suppliers, your accommodation providers, etc. But we sometimes forget that we should be very clearly communicating this to our clients, our leads, and potential guests as well. A best practice is when a departure is guaranteed, or when you've hit that minimum number, to actually communicate that. And more importantly, really communicate when or why this trip might be canceled. Not just for like force majeure or political instability, those types of reasons, but really explain how your trip minimum policy works. And this might be the case of, hey, if we don't have enough people going, then you as the company typically are refunding that person. But don't forget the better options, which are of course to reschedule them or try and combine 2 trips together. If that's not possible, then you might even consider going back and offering sort of private trip pricing. We sometimes see this with, hey, maybe we've got a family of 5 who's booked on this trip. Your trip minimum was 7 and 2 people just sort of canceled. And so we're at this situation where, okay, we just cancel and refund that family, or maybe we could go back and explain the situation and give them options. We always encourage you to empower those clients to be involved in the solution. And so we might offer and say, hey, if you want to turn this into a private trip, then here is what that private premium would be. That way we can still run it on this date if that's important to you. Our other options are, of course, to combine with this other date, or potentially keep the trip credit, or potentially do a refund. But involving them in the decision making is a great best practice. If you are running multi-day trips, you've probably encountered this decision of, hey, should I be all-inclusive, or should I have a la carte pricing for certain items on your tour? Across the industry, all-inclusive typically generates between 15 and 25% higher revenue per customer. And depending on who your customers are, they might prefer predictable pricing, and you can capture revenue on items that they would buy anyway. A la carte is more typically used when we want to appeal to budget travelers or offer quite a bit of flexibility. All-inclusive works when you want higher revenue per customer and simplified operations as a tour operator, and obviously lends itself to more luxury positioning. No matter what choice you're making, it's really important to be crystal clear on your sales materials, on your trip page, your brochures, your detailed itineraries, about what is included and what is not included. Activity fees, entry costs, think transportation to and from the start of the trip, gratuities and personal expenses. Is alcohol included or not included? Clarity is really the best practice. And as a quick aside, I did a lot of multi-day trip planning for Backroads tours. And just so you know, a great best practice is to have at least one on your own meal if you are doing sort of group meals, and not even have that all inclusive. Think of this not as, hey, we're going to cheap out on this, or hey, they're going to have to pay more. But what we're doing is creating maybe an opportunity for some self-exploration to decrease some of the rigidity that might be in your tour. So it's entirely appropriate, even with a, say, more luxury or all-inclusive tour, to have some elements, maybe a lunch or a dinner, where you're encouraging your guests to go out and create their own adventure. And there are many things that you can do to set them up for success, including recommendations, little maps or restaurant guides, but don't be afraid to have some of those on your own elements, even if you're doing all-inclusive. How should we think about insurance policies and force majeure type cancellations when we're doing our pricing? Well, we want to build protection into our policies more so than on our pricing. So for force majeure, we want to have clear terms about natural disasters, political unrest, pandemic restrictions, and make sure that that is crystal clear. A great best practice is to recommend trip insurance. So this is ultimately the customer purchasing this on their own, typically through a recommended third-party travel insurance company, and you can often earn commission by providing links or recommendations. Another best practice that is leveraged by some of our multi-day operators is your own internal trip protection. So think of this as distinct from third-party trip cancellation and trip protection insurance, but this, you're essentially having an individual upsell that you control, where you might be able to offer a more generous cancellation policy for an extra fee or an extra percentage of the trip cost. This essentially becomes profit that goes to you. It's a little more complex in multi-day situations, but just know this is possible. As always, clear communication is what's important. I love here on Alaska Alpine Adventures how they break their cancellation policy down into if we cancel, if God cancel, or if you cancel. 60 days out, 49 to 50 days out, or less than 45 days. It's crystal clear. Here's 3 other best practices. Fully refundable within 24 hours. Here, they're letting guests book with confidence and allowing them to change their mind within 24 hours for a full refund, no stress, no risk. In the second bullet, they're highlighting transparent pricing and essentially a lowest price guarantee. If you reserve directly with Alaska Alpine Adventures, either online or by phone, we guarantee you'll receive the best available rate. No need to shop around. And thirdly, that best practice of calling out interest-free payment plan options. Break up the cost without paying more. Reserve your trip now, spread out payments over time, 100% interest-free. So as you can see, with multi-day tour pricing, a lot of the fundamentals remain the same. It's especially important to know what our variable and fixed costs are. But I hope by going through each of these topics, we inspired you with a few best practices and a few missteps to avoid, to make sure that you are building in the policies, the protections, the buffers, and the minimums that are going to keep you profitable as a multi-day operator. If you haven't yet grabbed a copy of our tour pricing calculator, you can do so at guestfocus.com/pricing. And the way that we set this up is that you'll actually get to make a copy in sort of Google Sheets, and we highly encourage you to adapt this and modify it to suit your needs as a multi-day tour provider. Before you go, let us know in the comments down below, what are some of your pricing and policy best practices that you could share with the community. It would mean the world to us if you are getting value from this series, to not only share your best practice down below, but share it with a friend or a colleague. Thank you so much for tuning in and sharing, and we'll see you in the next video.